made fun of how small his savings account was, and he made me regret it. When I first met my husband, I thought life was perfect. We were a fun couple, always out and about, laughing, dancing, and doing all the exciting things that made life feel so good. Every weekend, we'd go somewhere new. Every holiday, we'd travel to another city or country. Our lives were full of adventures and bright moments, and I loved every single second of it. I honestly felt like we were unstoppable. Everything seemed so easy back then, and I never thought anything could change. Then, 2 years into our marriage, I got sick. Not just a cold or something small. It was the kind of sickness that needed doctors, long treatments, and surgery. It was scary and hard, and I was in pain for a long time. I hated feeling weak, and I hated seeing my husband worried. He stayed by my side the whole time, doing everything he could to make me feel better. But those hospital visits and surgeries weren't cheap, and soon our money started disappearing faster than we expected. Before I got sick, I didn't think much about money. We always had enough, so I didn't need to. But during that time, everything changed. My husband had to work longer hours to pay for my treatments. He stopped going out with friends and stopped buying things for himself. Every penny went toward the doctors and the medicine. I saw him getting tired, but I didn't know what to say. I felt guilty that my sickness was costing us so much, but at the same time, I felt like it wasn't my fault. I didn't choose to get sick. It just happened. Eventually, I got better. The doctor said I was fine now and didn't need any more treatments. I was so happy to feel normal again, but things weren't the same as before. We didn't have much money left, so we couldn't do the things we used to do. No more weekend trips, no fancy dinners, and definitely no vacations. My husband said we needed to save money and focus on rebuilding what we had lost. He was practical about it and didn't seem too bothered, but I missed the old days. At first, I tried to be patient. I told myself that things would get better soon. I believed that if we worked hard, we could go back to the life we had before. But as time went on, I started feeling frustrated. I didn't want to just sit at home all the time. I didn't want to spend every weekend watching TV or doing laundry. That wasn't the life I wanted, and it made me feel trapped. I started thinking about all the fun we used to have and how boring everything was now. It felt like my life had gone from bright colors to dull gray, and I hated it. I began dropping hints to my husband about going on a vacation. Nothing big or fancy, just a small trip somewhere nearby. I told him it would be good for both of us, a chance to relax and forget about all the stress we had been through. But every time I brought it up, he'd say the same thing. We can't afford it right now. He said we needed to save money, and a vacation just wasn't possible. I tried to explain that it didn't have to be expensive, but he didn't seem to understand. He kept saying no, and it made me angry. One day, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told him we needed to have fun again, that life wasn't just about working and saving money. He looked tired and said he was doing his best, but his best didn't feel like enough for me. I wanted more. I wanted the old us back, the happy, carefree couple that did whatever they wanted. But he didn't seem to care about that anymore. He just cared about paying bills and making sure we had food on the table. And sure, that was important, but it wasn't enough for me. I decided to stop talking to him for a while. If he wasn't going to listen to me, then I wasn't going to talk to him. I wanted him to see how upset I was. I wanted him to realize that I wasn't happy with the way things were. So, for an entire day, I didn't say a word to him. He tried to talk to me, but I ignored him. When he asked what was wrong, I acted like I didn't hear him. I wanted him to feel bad, to see how serious I was about needing something to change. By the end of the day, he looked so sad. He sat down next to me and tried to explain again why we couldn't afford a vacation. He said he was working as hard as he could and that he was doing it all for us. He said he wanted to make sure we were okay, that we had a roof over our heads and food on the table. But I didn't want to hear it. I told him he wasn't a good husband because he wasn't giving me what I needed. I told him he wasn't trying hard enough. And that's where it ended. I don't even know why I said that to him. I just felt so angry and frustrated, and I wanted him to feel the same way. But after I said it, he looked at me like I had broken something inside him. He didn't say anything back. He just stood up and walked away. 2 days after that fight, I decided to apologize to my husband, not because I truly felt bad for what I said, but because I had another plan in mind. I needed something from him, and I thought saying sorry would make him more likely to give it to me. I mean, I did feel a little bad about how things ended that night. He looked so hurt when I told him he wasn't a good husband, but honestly, I didn't think I was wrong. I just didn't want the tension in the house to keep dragging on, especially when I had something important to ask. You see, some of my friends had planned a weekend getaway, and they invited me to come along. It wasn't a big deal or anything. They were going to pay for almost everything, so all I needed was a plane ticket to get there. It felt like the perfect chance to have some fun again, to feel like my old self. I didn't even think twice about saying yes when they asked me to join them, but then I realized I didn't have the money for the ticket, and that's where my husband came in. I figured if I apologized and explained the situation, he'd agree to pay for it. After all, he was my husband, and husbands are supposed to make their wives happy. So, I walked up to him and said I was sorry for what I said the other day. I told him I didn't mean it and that I was just upset because I missed the fun life we used to have. He looked at me for a moment like he was trying to figure out if I was being sincere. I smiled and said it again, trying to sound as sweet as possible. He nodded and said it was okay, but I could tell he was still hurt. That's when I brought up the trip. I told him about the getaway and how all my friends were going. I explained how it wasn't going to cost much because they were paying for the hotel and food. I just needed the plane ticket, and it would be a small price to pay for me to have some time to relax and recharge. I thought he would understand. I mean, it wasn't like I was asking for a fancy vacation or anything. It was just one little ticket. But as soon as I finished talking, his expression changed. He looked at me and shook his head. He said he wasn't going to pay for the ticket because he didn't want me relying on other people to take care of me. He said it wasn't right for me to go on a trip where my friends were footing the bill, especially when we couldn't even afford to do things as a couple. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't like I was asking for a loan or begging strangers for money. These were my friends, and they offered to help. I tried to explain this to him, but he wouldn't budge. He said it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. He said he didn't like the idea of his wife depending on people who, in his words, weren't even real friends. That comment made me so mad. These were the same friends who always made me laugh and listened to me when I needed someone to talk to. They were the ones who made life feel fun and exciting again. How could he say they weren't real friends? When I asked him why he thought that, he said they were nowhere to be found when I was sick. He reminded me how he was the one who stayed by my side through everything, how he worked extra hours to pay for my treatments, and how he gave up so much to make sure I was okay. He asked me where those friends were when I was in the hospital, or when we needed help paying bills. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told him it wasn't fair to blame them for not being there. They had their own lives and problems to deal with. Besides, I was fine now, and that's what mattered. He didn't seem to agree. He said real friends would have shown up when I needed them the most, not just when it was convenient for them. He said I was blind to the fact that they only cared about me when things were good, not when things were hard. I rolled my eyes and told him he didn't understand because he didn't have any close friends like I did. I said he just didn't want to see me happy and that he was holding me back from enjoying my life. I know it wasn't fair to say that, but I was so frustrated, and I felt like he was being unreasonable. We went back and forth for what felt like hours. He kept saying he wouldn't buy the ticket and that he didn't want me going on a trip that we couldn't afford. He said it wasn't just about the money, but about the kind of example it set for our marriage. He said he didn't want us to rely on other people to live a life we couldn't afford ourselves. I told him he was overthinking it and making a big deal out of nothing. I said he was just being stubborn and controlling, and that he didn't care about what I wanted. He stayed calm the whole time, which only made me angrier. I wanted him to yell back at me or show some kind of emotion, but he just kept shaking his head and repeating the same thing. He wasn't going to pay for the ticket, and he didn't want me going. Finally, he got up and walked away without saying another word. I sat there feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. I couldn't believe he was being so difficult about something so small. All I wanted was one weekend to feel happy and free again, and he couldn't even give me that. After that argument about the plane ticket, I became grumpy around the house. I wasn't happy, and I wanted him to know it. I didn't shout or throw things, but I let my mood do all the talking. I made sure my sighs were loud enough for him to hear, and I walked around like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. I was angry, but more than that, I wanted him to feel guilty for saying no to me. I wanted him to regret it. I didn't know how else to get back at him, but I was determined to make him feel bad. The thing is, my husband was the one who had been doing most of the chores around the house ever since I got sick. When I wasn't feeling well, he stepped up and did everything. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, even grocery shopping. He didn't complain about it once. He just took care of things, and I let him. Even after I got better, he kept doing everything, and I didn't try to stop him. Honestly, I liked having less work to do. So when I thought about how to make him upset, I realized I couldn't just stop doing chores because I wasn't doing much of them to begin with. That's when I came up with another plan. If he needed my help with something, I'd just ignore him. It was small and petty, but it felt like the only way to get under his skin. I knew he hated asking for help because he liked doing things on his own, but every now and then, he would ask me to pitch in. So I decided that whenever he asked me to help, I would act like I didn't hear him or say I was too busy. It wasn't a nice thing to do, but I didn't care. I felt like he deserved it for not supporting me the way I wanted. At first, he didn't say much about it. He'd just sigh and do whatever needed to be done himself. But one day, he asked me to help him pick up some medication from the pharmacy because he was in a hurry to get to work. He was running late, and I could tell he really needed me to go. I heard him asking, but I pretended I didn't. I just sat there scrolling through my phone like I had all the time in the world. When he left the house, I felt a small twinge of guilt, but I pushed it aside. I told myself it wasn't a big deal and that he could figure it out on his own. The day went on, and I forgot all about the medication. When he came home later that evening, I could tell right away that he was upset. He asked me if I had gone to the pharmacy, and I told him I hadn't. I said I didn't think it was that important because I wasn't the one who needed any more medication. I didn't even bother to apologize because in my mind it wasn't a big deal. But then he looked at me with this mix of anger and sadness and said the medication wasn't for me. It was for him. I didn't know what to say. He told me it was something he needed for his anxiety and to help him sleep. I had no idea he was struggling with anxiety. He had never mentioned it before, and I never noticed anything wrong. I just assumed he was fine because he never talked about his feelings or showed any signs that he was stressed. But apparently, he had been dealing with it for a while, and now he needed medication to help him cope. Hearing that made me feel bad for a moment, but I didn't let it show. I didn't want him to think I cared too much after everything that had happened. He grabbed his keys and left to pick up the medication himself. I sat there feeling a mix of guilt and frustration. Part of me felt bad for not helping him, but another part of me thought it served him right. He was always so calm and collected, acting like he had everything under control. Now for the first time, I saw that he wasn't as strong as he pretended to be. It felt strange to see him like that, and I didn't know how to process it. So instead of trying to understand or support him, I told myself it was his own fault for not asking me nicely or explaining why it was so important. I stayed on the couch for the rest of the evening, flipping through channels and pretending nothing had happened. When he came back, he didn't say anything to me. He just went straight to the bedroom and shut the door. I could tell he was upset, but I didn't follow him. I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't feel like talking to him. I felt like I had won in some weird, petty way. He was mad, but so was I, and at that moment, it felt like we were even. A week after that messy day with the medication, my husband surprised me by saying we were going out for the weekend. He said we deserved to have some time to relax and enjoy ourselves, and I was immediately excited. It had been so long since we had done something nice together, and I thought maybe this was his way of trying to make up for everything that had happened. I imagined us going to a fancy restaurant, or maybe even somewhere with music and candlelight. I started planning what I would wear and how I would make sure I looked perfect for the evening. When the weekend came, he told me to get ready, and I felt a little flicker of happiness. I hadn't been feeling very close to him lately, and I thought maybe this was the start of something better. But when we pulled up to the restaurant, my excitement vanished. It wasn't fancy or special at all. It was a fast food place with bright lights and plastic chairs, the kind of place you'd take kids or grab a quick bite if you were in a hurry. My heart sank. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start an argument in public, but inside I felt so let down. I sat there eating my food quietly, but I couldn't hide how I felt. I didn't smile and I barely said a word. I just stared at my plate and gave short answers whenever he tried to talk to me. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I couldn't help it. I thought this was supposed to be a special night, and instead, it felt like an afterthought. It wasn't what I wanted or expected, and I couldn't pretend to be okay with it. When we got home later that night, he sat me down and told me he knew I wasn't happy about where we went. He said he was trying his best to give me a nice evening, but we still had debts to pay because of my treatment. He said we couldn't afford to be extravagant, but we still had to find ways to enjoy life together, even if it was something small. I didn't like hearing that. It felt like he was blaming me for everything, like it was my fault we were in this situation. I knew the medical bills were high, but I didn't choose to get sick. I didn't ask for any of this to happen. I got angry and told him he was making me feel guilty for something I couldn't control. I said it wasn't fair for him to throw my sickness in my face like that. He tried to explain that he wasn't blaming me and that he just wanted me to understand the reality of our situation, but I didn't want to hear it. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, and before he could say anything else, I started crying. I told him he was being unfair and that he didn't care about how I felt. Then I got up and went into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I locked myself in and sat on the bed, letting the tears flow. I didn't even know exactly why I was crying. Part of me felt bad for being so harsh, but another part of me was still angry and frustrated. I felt like he didn't understand how hard it was for me to adjust to this new version of our life. I missed how things used to be, and I didn't know how to accept that they might never go back to the way they were. I stayed in the room for the rest of the night, not caring if he came to check on me or not. I felt like I needed to be alone, but at the same time, I wanted him to come and apologize, to admit that he was wrong and that I was right. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as upset as I had been the night before. I didn't feel like facing anyone, but eventually, I dragged myself out of bed and walked into the kitchen. My husband was already dressed for work, standing by the table. He had prepared breakfast as usual, and he looked at me when I walked in. He told me he had to head out soon because he had a busy day ahead. I just nodded and didn't say a word. I didn't want to talk to him. I was still upset about everything, even though I wasn't sure exactly what I was upset about anymore. He left after a while, and I sat at the table staring at the breakfast he made. I didn't feel like eating it, so I pushed it aside and went back to the living room. The house felt quiet, and I hated the silence. I started pacing back and forth, and then out of nowhere I started pulling things out of place. It wasn't like I was trying to make a mess, it just kind of happened. I tossed some pillows off the couch, left a few empty glasses on the table, and didn't bother putting anything back where it belonged. I wasn't thinking about what I was doing. I was just annoyed and restless, and I didn't care about the mess I was making. By the end of the day, the house was a disaster. Clothes were scattered around, dishes were piled up in the sink, and there was stuff everywhere. I sat on the couch and looked at the mess, and for some reason, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I thought maybe my husband would come home, see the mess, and finally say something. I wanted him to notice it and get annoyed. I wanted him to ask me why the house was in such bad shape so I could have a reason to start another argument. But when he came home that evening, he didn't say a single word about it. He walked in, looked around for a second, and then went straight to the bedroom. He didn't even glance at me, and I could feel my anger bubbling up again. I sat there waiting for him to come back out and ask me what had happened, but he didn't. I heard him shower and then get into bed, and that was it. He went to sleep without saying anything. I was furious. I couldn't believe he wasn't reacting. I had spent the whole day creating this mess, and he didn't even care. It felt like I was invisible, like nothing I did mattered to him anymore. The next morning, I woke up and found him in the kitchen again, getting ready for work. He didn't bring up the mess, and I didn't mention it either. I thought about cleaning up, but I was still too annoyed to do it. I figured I'd deal with it later, but then something happened that I wasn't expecting. A couple of my friends showed up at the house without warning. They said they were in the area and decided to drop by to see me. I froze for a moment when I saw them standing at the door, because I remembered the state of the house. I hadn't cleaned up anything, and it was still a complete disaster. I let them in, feeling embarrassed as they looked around at the mess. I laughed nervously and made up some excuse about being too busy to clean, but I could tell they weren't buying it. I tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but inside I was panicking. I started rushing around, picking up clothes and dishes while they sat on the couch and pretended not to notice. I felt so flustered and annoyed, and the worst part was that my husband didn't even try to help me. He saw my friends when they came in, but he just gave a small nod and grabbed his things. He didn't say hello or offer to help me tidy up. He just left for work like he didn't have a care in the world. I knew he didn't like my friends, so I wasn't surprised that he didn't stick around, but it still made me mad. I felt like he was doing it on purpose, like he was trying to make me look bad in front of them. I couldn't believe he was just walking out while I was scrambling to clean up the mess. As soon as he left, I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. I wanted to blame him for everything, for the mess, for my embarrassment, for how chaotic my life felt. But deep down, I knew it wasn't his fault. I was the one who had made the mess, and I was the one who hadn't cleaned it up. I knew I was being unfair, but I couldn't stop myself from feeling angry. I kept running around the house, trying to make it look presentable, while my friends sat there awkwardly watching me. By the time my husband came home that evening, my friends had already left. The house looked a bit better since I had managed to clean up just enough to avoid complete embarrassment, but there were still dishes in the sink and a few things out of place. He didn't say anything about it, though. He just walked in, put his things down, and told me that I'd be joining him for a work dinner that evening. I wasn't exactly thrilled. I was still annoyed with him from earlier, and I didn't feel like spending the evening with his coworkers. But then I remembered how his work dinners were usually at fancy restaurants with good food and drinks, and everyone always dressed up and looked important. I thought it might be fun, so I decided to go. I went to the bedroom to get ready, spending extra time on my makeup and outfit because I wanted to look amazing. When we got to the dinner, I felt a little better. The restaurant was beautiful, with soft lighting and big, shiny tables. The smell of food filled the air, and I felt like I was in one of those places where rich people go. I looked around and smiled, thinking how much I had missed evenings like this. It felt like a glimpse of the life I wanted, fancy, exciting, and far away from the boring reality of our daily life at home. We sat at a big table with some of his coworkers. They were all laughing and chatting, and for a little while I just listened. They talked about work, their families, and some of the projects they were working on. Everyone seemed so full of ideas and plans, and I started to feel a little out of place. I didn't have much to add to the conversation, so I just sat there, smiling politely and sipping my drink. Then, one of his coworkers started talking about his plans to start a business. He sounded so confident and excited, like he had everything figured out. The others started asking him questions, and the conversation turned into a lively discussion about business ideas and investments. I could feel myself getting annoyed. It wasn't just the topic. It was the way everyone was so enthusiastic, like they were all in control of their lives and making big moves. It made me think about how stuck I felt, like I was missing out on something. Eventually, someone turned to my husband and asked him what his plans were. Everyone looked at him, waiting for his answer, and for a moment there was silence. I don't know why, but something about that moment made me feel bitter. Maybe it was because I knew we didn't have any big plans, or maybe it was because I felt like he hadn't done enough to make our lives better. Before he could say anything, I let out a loud laugh. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you're trying to make a point. Everyone looked at me, and I could see the surprise on their faces. Then I said something I shouldn't have. I made a joke about how small his savings account was, mocking the idea that he could ever start a business. I said it so casually, like it was no big deal, but the words hung in the air like a bad smell. And some people laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter you want to hear. It was awkward and uncomfortable, like they didn't know what else to do. Most people just looked away or shifted in their seats, clearly unsure of how to respond. I could feel the tension at the table, but instead of stopping, I smiled and acted like it was funny. I thought maybe if I pretended it was a harmless joke, Everyone else would too. But my husband didn't laugh. He didn't say anything, but I could see the frown on his face and the way his jaw tightened. He looked embarrassed, and I knew I had gone too far. But instead of apologizing, I acted like it wasn't a big deal. I told myself he was overreacting and that he needed to learn how to take a joke. I didn't want to admit that I had hurt him because that would mean admitting that I was wrong. The rest of the dinner felt awkward. People kept talking, but the energy at the table was different. My husband stayed quiet for most of it, and I could feel the tension between us growing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my food and pretending nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew I had messed up. I just didn't want to face it. When I got up to go to the restroom, I wasn't worried about anything. I figured the night would just keep going as it was. A little awkward, but nothing I couldn't brush off. I took my time there, fixing my makeup and looking at myself in the mirror, trying to shake off the weird tension from the dinner table. I told myself that everything would be fine, and maybe my husband just needed to lighten up. But when I came back to the table, my husband was gone. His chair was empty, and I felt a strange twist in my stomach. I looked around the restaurant, expecting to see him talking to someone or maybe just stepping outside for a moment, but he wasn't anywhere. I asked his friends where he had gone, and they told me he had left, just like that. He didn't say anything to me or wait for me, he just left. I felt embarrassed and a little panicked. I didn't know why he would leave without telling me, but deep down, I had a feeling it had something to do with the joke I made earlier. Still, I tried to play it cool in front of his friends, acting like it wasn't a big deal. But when it came time to leave, I realized he hadn't even paid for me to get home. I had to pull out my own money, which made me even angrier. I was mad at him for leaving and mad at myself for not thinking things through. When I got home, I saw him packing a small bag. He looked calm, but there was something different in his eyes. He told me that he was going to his parents' house for the weekend. I thought maybe he just needed some space, but then he said something that made my heart stop. He told me that when he came back next week, I should be gone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. At first, I thought he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. He was serious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt real panic. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I just stood there, frozen, as he grabbed his bag and walked out the door. Now I'm sitting here alone, and I don't know what to do. I feel terrible, but I also feel confused and scared. I keep thinking about everything I said and did, all the ways I hurt him without realizing how much damage I was doing. I wish I could take it all back, but it feels like it's too late. I don't know if he'll forgive me, and honestly, I don't know if I deserve it. And now all I can do is wait, hoping that somehow I can fix this, but I don't even know where to start. Update. It has been a month since my husband left the house. I thought time would help, that he would cool down, and maybe we could talk things out. I stayed in the house, waiting, hoping, convincing myself that when he came back, we'd sit down like adults and figure things out. I told myself that everything would blow over, just like it always did. But I was wrong. So wrong. When he came back and saw me still in the house, he was furious. I've never seen him that angry before. His face looked different, like he wasn't the same person anymore. He told me I had no right to still be there after everything I had done, after all the ways I had disrespected him and treated him like he didn't matter. He told me he had given me a chance to leave, and I didn't take it, so now he was done. And then he threw me out. I didn't think he actually would, but he did. He told me to pack my things and leave right then and there. I tried to argue, to say something, anything, but he wouldn't listen. He said he had made up his mind and nothing I said would change it. I felt like my whole world was crumbling around me as I grabbed what little I could and left. At first, I thought I could call my friends for help. I thought they would understand, that they'd be there for me and let me stay with them until I figured things out. But when I reached out to them, they all gave me the cold shoulder. Some of them didn't even bother to answer my calls or messages. The ones who did just made excuses, saying they were busy or couldn't help. It was like they had all decided I wasn't worth their time anymore. And that's when it hit me. They weren't my friends. My husband had been right all along. These were the same people who disappeared when I was sick, the same people who only cared about me when it was convenient for them. I had spent so much time defending them, making excuses for them, and putting them first, but now I see the truth. They don't care about me. They never did. Now I'm on my own, and life is harder than I ever thought it could be. I'm trying to find a job, but it's not easy. I haven't worked in years, and I don't have the skills or experience that most employers are looking for. I've been sending out applications every day, but I haven't gotten a single call back. The bills are piling up, and I don't even know how I'm going to pay for my next meal. All those trips I wanted to take, all those fancy restaurants and clothes I dreamed about, they don't matter anymore. None of it matters. Right now, all I care about is surviving. I would give anything to go back to the simple life I had with my husband, even if it wasn't perfect. I didn't appreciate it when I had it, and now it's gone. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about everything I did wrong. Reading the comments from my last post really opened my eyes. So many people told me I was selfish, ungrateful, and toxic, and honestly, they were right. I didn't want to see it before, but now I can't ignore it. I hurt my husband in so many ways, and I didn't even realize how much damage I was doing. I let my pride and my selfishness ruin my marriage, and now I'm paying the price. I feel terrible about the way I treated him, and I wish I could take it all back. I know it's too late for that, but I hope he can forgive me someday. I don't deserve it, but I hope he can. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I need to change. I need to be better, not just for him, but for myself. I've hit rock bottom, and there's nowhere to go but up. It's going to be hard, but I'm determined to make things right, even if it takes the rest of my life. I just hope it's not too late.